The Travelling Companion. A dead man whom one has helped to find rest, as a travelling companion who enables the hero to overcome trials and release a bewitched girl, this is quite as strange a plot as any. It has fired the imagination of the writer of no less a work than the scriptural Book of Tobit, and of Hans Christian Andersen, whose presentation as the travelling companion is given here, as an example of the way in which a spare and terse legend was presented in the fiction of his time. The story's history also involves the ancient English romance Sir Amadas, and Basque, Spanish and French country tales. It has been reincarnated in Italy as a novel, Messa Danese, and a poem, Brunetto's Constantino. A Scottish Gaelic version has been collected by the celebrated Celtic scholar Professor Kenneth Jackson in Nova Scotia. Its enduring attraction is also seen in its appearance in Grimm in the 19th century, and back to Straparola in 1550, as well as in the narrations among the folktale reciters of Armenia, Scandinavia, Italy and Turkey, and among the Gypsies, Slavs, Indians and Scottish West Highlanders. The story is here left in the form in which English presenters of Andersen customarily offered it in the heyday of his popularity. Poor John was sorely troubled, for his father was sick unto death. They two were absolutely alone in the little room. The lamp upon the table was just flickering out, and the night was far gone. "You have been a good son, John," said the sick father. "God will help you on in the world." And he looked at him with grave, gentle eyes, drew a deep, deep breath, and died. It was just as if he had fallen asleep. But John fell a-weeping. He had now no one left in the whole world, neither father nor mother, sister nor brother. Poor John! He knelt before the coffin and kissed the hand of his dear father. Many were the tears he wept, but at last his eyes closed, and he fell asleep with his head upon the hard bedpost. Then he dreamed a wondrous dream. He saw the sun and moon bow down before him, and he saw his father fresh and hearty again, and he heard him laugh as he always used to laugh when he was pleased. A lovely girl with a gold crown on her long fair hair held out her hand to him, and his father said, "Look what a nice bride you've got. She is the loveliest bride in the whole world." Then he awoke, and all this bliss was gone. His father lay dead and cold on the bed. There was absolutely no other with them. Poor John! A week afterwards the dead man was buried. John walked close behind the coffin. He would never see again the kind father who had loved him so much. He heard them throw the earth down on the coffin. He caught sight of the last corner of it, but the next spadeful of earth that was thrown down hid that also. Then his grief overcame him, and his heart was nigh to breaking. Those around the grave sang a hymn. It sounded so pretty, and the tears came into John's eyes. He cried, and it did his heart good. The sun shone beautifully on the green trees, as if it would say, "Don't be distressed, John. Can't you see how lovely the blue sky is? Your father is up there now, praying to God that things may always go well with you." "I will always be good," said John, "and then I also shall go to heaven and be with my father. Oh, how joyful it will be when we see each other again! What a lot I shall have to tell him, and he too will show me so many things and teach me so much about the beauty of heaven, just as he used to teach me here on earth. Oh, how joyful it will be!" All this passed so vividly before John's mind that he could not but smile at the thought of it, though the tears were all the time running down his cheeks. The little birds were sitting on the chestnut trees and twittering, "Tweewit, tweewit." They were so happy, though they also had been at the funeral. But they knew well enough that the dead man was now in heaven, and had wings finer and larger than theirs, and that he was now happy, because he had been good on earth, and they were quite delighted at the thought of it. John saw them flit away from the green trees far out into the wide world, and he was minded to follow their example. But first he carved a large wooden cross to place over his father's grave, and when he brought it in the evening, he found the grave nicely trimmed with sand and flowers. Strangers had done this, for they had loved the dead father. Early next morning, John packed up his little bundle, hid in his belt the whole of his patrimony, some 50 rix-dollars and a couple of silver pence, and resolved to seek his fortune in the wide world. But first he went into the churchyard to his father's grave, recited Our Father, and said, "Farewell, dear Dad. I will always be a good man, and oh, pray God that it may be well with me." As John went through the fields, all the flowers stood so fresh and beautiful in the warm sunlight, and they nodded in the wind as if they would say, "Welcome to the green fields. Is it not lovely here?" But John turned himself round once more to look at the church where he, as a little boy, had been christened, and where he had gone every Sunday with his old father and sung hymns, and he saw standing high up in one of the holes of the tower the church elf in his little red-pointed cap, shading his face with both hands, so that the sun might not shine into his eyes. John nodded farewell to him, and the little elf swung his red cap, put his hand on his heart, and kissed his fingers to him again and again, to show that he wished him well and a right prosperous journey. John thought of all the fine things that he was going to see in the wide, magnificent world, and went farther and farther away, farther than he had ever been before. He knew absolutely nothing of the towns he passed through, or the people he met. He was far away among total strangers. The first night he was obliged to sleep in a haystack in the fields, for he had no other bed. Yet it seemed very cosy to him. The king himself could not have been better off. The whole plain, with the river, the haystack, and the blue sky above it all, what finer bedchamber could one have? The green grass, with the tiny red and white flowers, was the carpet. The elder bushes and the hedges of wild roses were the bouquets of flowers on the dressing table. And for his bath he had the whole river with the clear, fresh water, where the rushes nodded and said both good morning and good evening. The moon, high up under the blue ceiling, was a splendid large night lamp, and it didn't set fire to the curtains either. John could sleep quite comfortably, and so he did, and he awoke again when the sun rose, and all the little birds round about sang, "Good morning, good morning, are you not up yet?" The bells were ringing for church. It was Sunday. The people went to hear the parson preach, and John went with them and sang a hymn and heard God's word, and it was just as if he was in his own church where he had been christened and had sung hymns with his father. There were so many graves in the churchyard, and some of them were overgrown with tall grass. This made John think of his father's grave. It might get to look like these when he was no longer there to trim and weed it. So he sat himself down and plucked off the grass, put up again the wooden crosses that had fallen down, and put back in their proper places the wreaths which the wind had torn away from the graves, thinking to himself all the while, "Perchance someone will do the same to my father's grave, now that I am far away." Outside the churchyard stood an old beggar leaning on his staff. John gave him all the little silver coins he had, and then went on his way into the wide world so happy and contented. Towards evening a terrible storm arose. John made haste to get under cover, but dark night had fallen upon him before he came at last to a little church, which stood all alone on the top of a little hill. Fortunately, the door stood ajar, and he crept in, and determined to stay there till the storm had passed away. "I will lay me down in a corner," said he. "I am quite tired and feel the need of a little rest." So he sat down, folded his hands, and said his evening prayers. And before he knew it, he was asleep and dreaming, while outside it was still thundering and lightning. When he awoke again, it was midnight, but the storm had passed away, and the moon was shining through the windows upon him. In the middle of the nave stood an open coffin with a dead man in it, for he had not yet been buried. John was not at all afraid, for he had a good conscience, and besides, he knew that the dead hurt no one. It is living, wicked men who do harm. Two such living, wicked people stood at that moment beside the dead man who had been placed in the church before being put in his grave. They wanted to do him harm. They would not let him lie in peace in his coffin, but wanted to cast him into the churchyard outside. Poor dead man! "Why do you do that?" asked John. "'Tis an evil, wicked deed. Let him sleep in Jesu's name." "Stuff and nonsense," said the two horrid men. "He has cheated us. He owes us money which he could not pay, and now he has died into the bargain, and so we shan't get a farthing. That is why we mean to tear him out of his coffin. He shall lie outside the church door like a dog." "I have no more than 50 rixdollars," said John. "It is my whole inheritance, but I will cheerfully give it to you if you will faithfully promise me to leave the poor dead man in peace. I can get on well enough without the money. I have strong, healthy limbs, and God will always help me." "Well," said the horrid men, "if you will pay his debts as you say, you may be quite certain that we shan't do anything to him." And so they took the money from John, laughed heartily at his softness, and went their way. But John placed the corpse back decently in its coffin, crossed its hands, said farewell, and went with a light heart through a great forest. Wherever the moon managed to shine in through the trees, he saw on every side of him the prettiest little elves all playing gaily. They did not mind him in the least, for they knew very well that he was good and guileless, and it is only wicked people who cannot see the elves. Some of them were no bigger than your finger, and had their long yellow hair done up with gold combs. They rocked to and fro in couples on the large dewdrops which lay on the leaves and tall grass. Sometimes the dewdrops slipped from under them, and down they fell among the long straw stalks, and then there was such laughter and uproar among the other wee mannikins. It was prodigiously funny. Then they began singing, and John recognized at once all the pretty songs he had learnt as a little boy. Big speckled spiders with silver crowns on their heads weaved long swinging bridges and palaces from one hedge to another, which, when the fine dew fell upon them, looked like shining crystal in the bright moonshine, and thus it went on until the sun rose. Then the little elves crept into the flower blossoms, and the wind dispersed their bridges and palaces, which swung to and fro in the air like big spider webs. John had just come out of the wood when a strong, manly voice exclaimed behind him, "Hello, comrade, whither away?" "Out into the wide world," said John. "I am a poor fellow without father or mother, but I am sure God will help me." "I also am going into the wide world," said the man. "Shall we two go together?" "With pleasure," said John. So they pursued the way in company, and soon got to like each other very much, for they were both good fellows. But John soon perceived that the stranger was much wiser than he. He had been nearly the whole world over, and there was nothing in existence that he could not tell you something about. The sun was already high in the sky when they sat them down under a large tree to eat their breakfast, and the same moment an old woman came up. Oh, she was so old, quite crooked in fact, and leaned upon a crutch. She had a bundle of firewood on her back, which she had picked up in the wood. Her apron was tucked up, and John saw 3 big bundles of bracken and willow twigs sticking out of it. When she got quite close to them, her foot slipped. She fell down and gave a loud shriek, for the poor old woman had broken her leg. John immediately proposed that they should carry her to her home, but the stranger opened his knapsack, took out a jar, and said he had a salve which would make her leg quite well and sound again in a minute, so that she could go home herself just as if she had never broken her leg at all. In return for this, however, he wanted her to give him the 3 bundles which she had in her apron. "You ask a good price," said the old woman, and nodded her head very mysteriously. She would have liked very much to keep her bundles, but it was no joke to lie there with a broken leg. So she gave him the bundles, and no sooner had he rubbed the salve on her leg than up sprang the old granny and went on her way much more briskly than before. A wonderful salve truly, but you could not get it at any apothecary's. "What do you want with those bundles?" inquired John of his comrade. "Oh, they are 3 pretty nosegays," said he. "I have taken rather a fancy to them, for I am a strange sort of fellow." So they went on a bit farther. "Why, how overcast it is getting," said John, and pointed ahead of him. "There are some terribly big clouds over there." "Nay," said his travelling companion, "those are not clouds, they are mountains. The beautiful big mountains where one can get right above the clouds into the bracing air, and splendid it is, I can tell you. Tomorrow we shall certainly be a good step on our journey into the wide world." The mountains were nothing like so close as they seemed. It took them a whole day to get to the spot where the black woods grew right up against the sky, and where there were stones as big as a whole town. A stiff pull it would be before they could get right up there, and therefore John and his travelling companion went first of all into an inn to have a good rest and brace themselves up for their journey on the morrow. A crowd of people were assembled in the tap room, for there was a puppet showman there. He had just set up his little theatre, and the people sat all around to see the play. But a fat old butcher had taken the front seat, which was by far the best. His big bulldog, ugh, how grim it looked, sat by his side and glared at all the company. And now the play began, and a very pretty play it was, with a king and queen who sat upon a velvet throne, and had gold crowns on their heads and long trains behind their robes, for they could afford it. The prettiest dolls with glass eyes and large whiskers stood at all the doors, and opened and shut them continually so as to let fresh air into the room. It was quite a pretty play, and not at all sad, but just as the queen arose and was walking across the stage, then heaven only knows what the bulldog was thinking about. But anyhow, as the fat butcher was not holding him, he made one bound into the middle of the stage, and seized the queen round the waist so that it went knick-knack. It was a horrible sight. The poor man who was acting the whole play was frightened and distressed about his queen, for she was the prettiest doll he had, and now the ugly bulldog had bitten her head off. But when all the people had gone away, the stranger who had come with John said that he would soon make her all right again, and so he took out his jar and smeared the doll with salve, as he had helped the poor old woman when she had broken her leg. As soon as ever the doll was rubbed, she became all right again at once. Nay, she could now move all her limbs about herself. You had not even to pull the string. The doll became like a living creature, except that it could not talk. The man who had the little puppet theatre was delighted. He now had no need to hold the doll at all. It could dance of its own accord. Now when it was night, and all the people in the inn had gone to bed, somebody was heard to sigh lamentably, and kept it up so long that everyone else got up to see what it could be. The man who had acted the play went to his little theatre, for it was from thence that the sighing seemed to come. All the wooden dolls lay higgledy-piggledy. The king and his guards were all mixed up together, and it was they who were sighing so piteously and staring with their big glass eyes, for they wanted so much to be rubbed with the ointment like the queen, that they also might be able to move about of their own accord. The queen sank down upon her knees and held her pretty gold crown up in the air while she seemed to pray, "Oh, take it, but anoint my consort and my courtiers." Then the poor man who owned the play and all the puppets could not help weeping, for it made him feel so sorry for them all. He promised to give the travelling companion all the money he took for his play the next evening, if he would only smear 4 or 5 of his prettiest dolls with the ointment. But the travelling companion said that all he asked in return was the big sword that hung by the man's side, and when he got it, he smeared 6 dolls with the ointment, and they immediately fell a-dancing so prettily that all the girls, the living human girls who were looking on, fell a-dancing as well. The coachman and the scullery maid, the lackey and the parlour maid danced together, and all the strangers followed suit, and the poker and tongs likewise, but the last 2 tumbled down at the very first caper. Oh, it was a merry night. Next morning John left them all and went right away with his comrade up the high mountains and through the large pine forests. They went so high up that the church towers far below looked like small red berries in the midst of all the green, and they could see far, far away, many, many a mile, where they had never yet been. John had never in his life seen so much of the beautiful world at one time, and the sun shone so warmly from out of the fresh blue sky. He heard, too, the hunters blowing their horns among the mountains, and it was so lovely and blissful that the water came into his eyes for joy, and he could not help saying, "O God, how good thou art! I could kiss thee, because thou art so good to us all, and has given us as our own all the beauty that is in the world." His companion, too, stood with folded hands and gazed away over wood and town in the warm sunshine. At that moment there was a wondrously delightful sound high over their heads. They looked up into the air. A large white swan was sweeping through the sky. It was so beautiful, and it sang as they had never heard a bird sing before. But it gradually grew weaker and weaker, bowed its head, and at last sank quite slowly down at their feet, where it lay dead, the lovely bird. "2 such beautiful big white wings as that bird has got are worth money," said the travelling companion, "and I mean to take them with me. Now you can see what a good thing it was I took the sword." And with one blow he cut off both the swan's wings, for he meant to keep them. And now they journeyed many and many a mile across the mountains, till at last they saw before them a large city with many hundreds of towers, which shone like silver in the sunlight. In the midst of the city was a splendid marble palace covered with real gold, and there dwelt the king. John and his travelling companion would not go into the city at once, but stopped at an inn outside to smarten themselves up, for they wanted to look nice when they walked about the streets. The host told them that the king was a good man who never harmed anyone, but his daughter, God preserve us, she was indeed a wicked princess. She was beautiful enough, indeed no one could be more pretty and captivating than she, but what was the good of that when she was a vile, wicked witch, through whose fault so many handsome princes had lost their lives? She had given everyone leave to woo her. Anybody might come forward, whether he was prince or beggar, it was all the same. He had only to guess 3 things she asked him. If he could give the right answers, she would marry him, and he would reign over the whole land when her father died. But if he could not guess these three things, she had him hanged or beheaded. So evil and wicked was this lovely princess. Her father, the old king, was sore afflicted at this state of things, but he could not prevent her from being so wicked, for he had once said that he would have nothing whatever to do with her lovers, and that she could do what she liked in that matter. Hitherto, every prince who had tried to guess the questions so as to win the princess had always failed, and so had either been hanged or beheaded, and yet he had always been warned beforehand not to woo her. The old king was so grieved at all the sorrow and misery caused thereby that once a year he knelt down all day with his soldiers and prayed that the princess might become good. But this she absolutely refused to be, and even the old women who drank brandy dyed it quite black before they drank it, by way of mourning, for what else could they do? "The nasty princess," said John. "She should really have the birch rod. It would do her good. If only I were the old king, she should bleed for it yet." But of course a king may not break his word, and this king had promised not to interfere. At that moment they heard the people outside cry, "Hurrah!" The princess was passing by, and she really was so lovely that all the people forgot for the moment how wicked she was, and so they cried, "Hurrah!" Fresh, lovely maidens, all in white silk gowns with golden tulips in their hands, rode on coal-black horses by her side. The princess herself had a chalk-white horse bedecked with diamonds and rubies. Her riding habit was of pure gold, and the whip she had in her hand looked like a sunbeam. The gold crown on her head was as if made of little stars taken from the sky, and her mantle was embroidered with the wings of thousands and thousands of little butterflies. At the same time, she was ever so much lovelier than her raiment. When John caught sight of her, he turned as red in the face as a drop of blood, and could scarcely utter a single word. The princess looked exactly like the beautiful girl with the gold crown whom he had dreamed about on the night his father died. He thought her so beautiful, and could not help loving her. It was certainly not true, thought he, that she could be an evil witch who had people hanged or beheaded when they could not guess what she asked them. Everyone, they say, even the poorest beggar, has leave to woo her. Then I too will go up to the palace, because I really can't help it. Everyone said that he ought not to do so. He would certainly fare as all the others had done. His travelling companion also dissuaded him, but John declared that it would all come right, brushed his shoes and jacket, washed his face and hands, combed his beautiful yellow hair, and so went quite alone into the city and up to the palace. "Come in," said the old king when John knocked at the door. John opened the door, and the old king, in a dressing gown and embroidered slippers, came to meet him. He had a gold crown upon his head, his sceptre in one hand, and the orb in the other. "Wait a bit," said he, and he shoved the orb under one arm, so as to be able to shake hands with John. But as soon as he understood that it was another wooer, he began to weep so violently that the sceptre and orb fell upon the floor, and he had to dry his tears with his dressing gown. Poor old king! "Don't do it," said he. "It will go as badly with you as with all the others." "Well, you shall see for yourself." And so he led John into the princess's pleasure garden. Oh, what a horrible sight! On every tree hung 3 or 4 kings' sons who had wooed the princess, but had been unable to guess the things she had asked them. Every time the wind blew, all their bones rattled so that the small birds were scared away and never dared to come into the garden. All the flowers were tied to dead men's bones instead of sticks, and grinning skulls stood in all the flower pots. That was a nice garden for a princess. "Look there now," said the old king. So it will fare with you as with all the others you see here. Give up the idea, do. You make me positively wretched. I take it so much to heart." John kissed the hand of the good old king, and said that it would come all right in the end, for he was so fond of the lovely princess. At the same moment the princess herself came riding into the courtyard with all her ladies, so they went out to meet her and said good day. She was lovely indeed, and she held out her hand to John, who loved her more than ever. She surely could never be the evil, wicked witch that all the people said she was. They went up into the drawing-room, and the little pages presented them with sweetmeats and gingerbread nuts. But the old king was so grieved that he could not eat anything, and besides, the gingerbread nuts were too tough for his teeth. It was now arranged that John was to come up to the palace again next morning, when the judges and the whole Senate would be gathered together to hear how he got on with the guessing. If he got through with it, he was to come twice more, but hitherto there had never been anyone who had guessed the first time, and so they had all lost their lives. John was not a bit anxious as to how he should fare. He was in the best of humours, thought of nothing but the charming princess, and believed firmly that God would help him somehow, but how he had no idea, nor would he even bestow a single thought upon it. He actually danced along the highway as he went back to his inn, where his travelling companion awaited him. John could not find words to express how nice the princess had been to him, and how beautiful she was. He longed already for the next day to come, that he might go to the palace again, and try his luck at guessing. But his travelling companion shook his head and was very sad. "I am so fond of you," said he, "and we might have been companions together for a long time to come yet. Poor dear John, I could weep my eyes out, but I won't spoil the last evening, perhaps, that we shall ever spend together. We will be merry, right merry. Tomorrow, when you are gone, I shall have cause to weep." All the people in the city had immediately got to know that a new wooer had arrived, and accordingly there was great lamentation. The theatre was closed, all the cake women tied pieces of crepe round their sugar pigs, the king and the priests knelt in the church. There was such a lamentation, for how could it possibly fare better with John than with all the suitors who had gone before him? Towards evening the travelling companion brewed a large bowl of punch, and said to John that they would now be jolly together, and drink the princess's health. But when John had drunk 2 glasses, he became so drowsy that he could not keep his eyes open, so he fell fast asleep. The travelling companion lifted John very softly from the chair and laid him on the bed. And when it was night and quite dark, he took the 2 large wings which he had cut off the swan, bound them tightly to his shoulders, put in his pocket the largest of the bundles of birches which he had got from the old woman who had fallen and broken her leg, opened the window, and flew away over the city straight to the palace, where he crouched down in a corner just under the window which looked into the princess's bedroom. The whole city lay in silence when the clock struck 11:45. Then the window flew open, and the princess flew out in a large white cape and with long black wings, right across the town to a large mountain. The travelling companion made himself invisible, so that she could not see him at all, flew behind her, and whipped the princess with his birches till he drew blood. Ugh! That was something like a flight through the air. The wind caught her cape, so that it bulged out on all sides like a huge sail, and the moon shone through it. "How it hails! How it hails!" said the princess at every blow she got from the birches, and she had quite enough of it too. At last she came right up to the mountainside and knocked. There was a rolling sound like thunder, while the mountain opened and the princess went in, the travelling companion following after, for no one could see him. He was invisible. They went through a large, long passage where the walls sparkled most wondrously. There were thousands and thousands of red-hot spiders there that ran up and down the walls and glowed like fire. And now they came to a large room built of gold and silver. Flowers as large as sunflowers, red and blue, gleamed on the walls. But none could pluck these flowers, for their stalks were nasty, venomous serpents, and the blossoms were the flames that came out of serpents' mouths. The atmosphere was all full of shining glowworms and sky-blue bats, which flapped their gossamer wings to and fro. It was indeed a strange sight. In the middle of the floor was a throne supported by 4 skeleton horses, with a harness of fiery red spiders. The throne itself was of milk-white glass, and the cushions were small black mice, which bit each other in the heel continually. Above the throne was a canopy of rosy red spider webs, sewn with the prettiest small green flies, which sparkled like precious stones. In the midst of the throne sat an old troll, with a crown upon his hideous head and a sceptre in his hand. He kissed the princess on the forehead, invited her to sit down beside him on the gorgeous throne, and then the music began. Big black grasshoppers played on the Jew's harp, and the owl beat his stomach with his wings to supply the place of a drum. It was a ridiculous concert. Wee pixies with will-o'-the-wisps in their caps danced round and round the room. No one could see the travelling companion. He had posted himself right behind the throne, and heard and saw everything. The courtiers, for they also now came in, were smart and distinguished-looking, but anyone who had eyes to see could perceive soon enough what sort of people they were. They were neither more nor less than broomsticks with cabbage heads on, who had come alive by the magic spells of the troll, and they were dressed up in fine brocaded garments. But that didn't matter a bit. They were only there for show. So there was a little dancing, and after that the princess told the troll that she had got a new wooer, and therefore wanted to know what question she should put to him when he came up to the palace next morning.
"Listen," said the troll, "and I'll tell you. You must choose something very easy, and then it will never occur to him. Think of your own slipper. He won't guess that. Then have his head cut off. But don't forget to bring me his eyes, for I want to eat them."
The princess curtsied very low, and said she would not forget the eyes. Then the troll opened the mountain, and she flew home again. But the travelling companion followed after and flogged her so vigorously with the birches that she groaned at the violence of the hailstorm, and hastened as fast as she could to her bedroom again through the window. Then the travelling companion flew back to the inn where John was sleeping soundly, unloosed his wings, and laid himself down upon the bed, for he was very tired, to say the least of it. It was quite early in the morning when John awoke. The travelling companion rose at the same time, and told him that he had dreamed a very strange dream that night, about the princess and one of her shoes, and bade him therefore ask, when it came to the point, whether the princess had not thought of one of her own shoes. This indeed was what he had heard from the troll in the mountain, but he would not tell John anything about that, but simply bade him ask if she had not thought of one of her slippers. "I may just as well ask about that as about anything else," said John. "You may perhaps have dreamt the right answer after all, for I believe that God helps me at all times. At the same time, however, I will bid you farewell, for if I guess wrong, I shall never see you more." So they kissed each other, and John went off to the city and up to the palace. The whole of the grand saloon was quite full of people. The judges sat in easy chairs, and they rested their heads on eider-down cushions, because they had so much to think about. The old king stood up and dried his eyes with a white pocket handkerchief. And now the princess entered. She was even lovelier than yesterday, and saluted them all so sweetly. To John she gave her hand and said, "Good morning to you." And now John had to guess what she was thinking about. Heavens, how kindly she looked! But the instant she heard him say one word, slipper, her face became chalky white, and she trembled in every limb. But it profited her nothing, for he had guessed rightly. Bless me, how glad the old king was! He cut capers till the boards rocked again, and all the people clapped their hands for him and John, who had thus guessed rightly the first time. The travelling companion beamed with joy when he heard how well it had all gone off, but John clasped his hands and thanked God, who, he felt sure, would help him the 2 remaining times. The second guessing was fixed for the following day. The same thing happened that evening as on yesternight. When John fell asleep, his travelling companion flew after the princess into the mountain and flogged her even harder than the first time, for he took 2 bundles of birches with him on this occasion. Nobody could see him, and he heard everything. The princess was to think of her glove, and he told this to John as if he had dreamt it again, so John was able to guess aright, and oh, what joy there was in the palace! The whole court cut capers just as they had seen the king do the first time. But the princess lay upon the sofa and would not say a single word. Now all depended upon whether John would guess rightly the 3rd time. If things went well, he was to have the lovely princess and inherit the whole kingdom when the old king died. But if he guessed wrongly, he would lose his life and the troll would eat his beautiful eyes. The evening before, John went early to bed, said his prayers, and then dropped off into a sweet sleep. But the travelling companion bound the wings to his shoulders, fastened his sword by his side, took all 3 bundles of birches with him, and then flew to the palace. It was a pitch-black night. The storm raged so that the tiles flew from the roofs of the houses, and the trees in the garden where the skeletons hung swayed to and fro like reeds in the blast. Lightning flashed every moment, and the thunder rolled till it seemed like a single peal lasting through the livelong night. And now the window sprang open, and the princess flew out. She was as pale as death, but she laughed wildly at the bad weather. It didn't seem rough enough for her, and her white cape whirled round in the air like a huge sail. But the travelling companion scourged her with his 3 bundles of birches, till her blood dripped down upon the ground, and she could scarcely fly any farther. At last, however, she came to the mountain. "How it hails and blows!" she cried. "Never have I been out in such weather before."
"Yes," said the troll, "one may have too much of a good thing."
And then she told him that John had guessed aright the 2nd time also. If he did so again on the morrow, victory would be his, and she could never come out to the troll in the mountain again, and would never be able to practice her enchantments as heretofore, whereupon she was sore distressed.
"He will not be able to guess this time," said the troll. "I will find something the thought of which has never entered his head, unless he be an even greater magician than I am. But now let us be merry."
And with that he took the princess by both hands, and they danced round and round with all the little pixies and will-o'-the-wisps that were in the room, and the red spiders ran up and down the walls with equal glee. The fireflowers glowed and sparkled, the owl beat the drum, the crickets piped, and the grasshoppers blew upon their jews-harps. It was a right merry ball. When the dance had lasted some time, the princess declared that she must go home or she would be missed at the palace. The troll said that he would go with her, so that they might have a little more time together. Away they flew through the bad weather, and the travelling companion beat his birches to shreds on their backs. Never had the troll been out in such a hailstorm. Outside the palace he bade the princess farewell, and the same instant he whispered softly to her,
"Think of my head."
But the travelling companion heard it all the same, and at the very moment when the princess glided through the window to her bedroom, and the troll was about to turn back again, he seized him by his long black beard and hewed off his hideous trollish head close upon his shoulders with his sword, before the troll himself was aware of it. He hurled the body down into the sea for the fishes, but the head he merely dipped once or twice in the water, and then he tied it up in his silk pocket handkerchief, and took it home with him to the inn, and laid himself down to sleep. Next morning he gave the pocket handkerchief to John, but told him not to unloose it till the princess herself asked him what it was she was thinking of. There were so many in the grand saloon in the palace that they stood as close together as radishes tied up in a bundle. The council sat in their chairs with the soft cushions, and the old king had new clothes on, and his gold crown and sceptre had been well furbished up for the occasion and looked splendid. But the princess was quite pale, and had on a coal-black dress, just as if she was going to a funeral. "What have I been thinking of?" said she to John, and straightway he loosed the pocket handkerchief, and was quite terrified himself when he saw the hideous troll's head. Everyone shuddered, for it was indeed a terrible sight. But the princess sat there like a stone statue, and could not utter a single word. At last she got up and gave John her hand, because he had guessed aright, and there was no denying it. She looked neither to the right nor to the left, but sighed from the bottom of her heart and said, "You are now my lord and master. This evening we will celebrate our wedding."
"I don't object," said the old king. "We would have it so."
All the people then cried, "Hurrah!" The guards on duty played music in the streets, the bells rang, and the cake women took the crepe off their sugar pigs, for the joy was universal. 3 oxen roasted whole and stuffed full with geese and pullets were placed in the middle of the marketplace, and everyone could come and help himself. The fountains were running with wine of the best sort, and everyone who bought a halfpenny roll at the baker's received 6 large buns into the bargain, and buns with raisins in them too. In the evening the whole town was illuminated, and the soldiers fired their guns, and the boys let off crackers, and in the palace there was no end of eating and drinking and toasting and dancing, and all the fine gentlemen and lovely young ladies danced with each other, and you could hear them singing ever so far off. But the princess was still a witch for all that, and cared not an atom for John. The travelling companion did not forget this, and he therefore gave John 3 feathers from the swan's wings, and a little flask with some drops in it, and he told him to place by the side of the bridal bed a large vat full of water. And just as the princess was about to get into bed, he was to give her a little shove so that she should fall into the water, when he was to duck her 3 times, taking care first of all, however, to throw the feathers and the drops in. In that way the enchantment would be broken, and she would get to be very fond of him. John did all that his travelling companion had advised him. The princess shrieked loudly when he ducked her under the water, and wriggled between his hands like a huge coal-black swan with sparkling eyes. When she came up to the surface of the water the second time, the swan was white, with the exception of a single black ring round its neck. John prayed devotedly to God, and let the water gurgle for the 3rd time over the bird's head, whereupon it immediately changed into the loveliest of princesses. She was even handsomer than before, and thanked him with tears in her beautiful eyes for breaking her spells. Next morning the old king came in state with his whole court, and the ceremony of congratulation lasted all day. Last of all came the travelling companion, staff in hand, with his knapsack on his shoulder. John kissed him again and again, and said he must not go away, but must stay with him, for all his good fortune was owing to him. But the travelling companion shook his head, and said to him very gently and kindly, "Nay, for my time is now up. I have only paid my debts. Do you recollect the dead man to whom evildoers would have done a mischief? You gave all you had that he might have rest in his grave. That dead man is myself." And he straightway was gone. The wedding lasted a whole month. John and the princess loved each other dearly, and the old king lived many happy days and let their wee children ride a cock-horse on his knee and play with his sceptre. But John reigned over the whole realm.